Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. Often, we struggle alone in our classrooms where we might have multilingual learners, we might have special education students. Every now and then, though, school districts do put multiple teachers in a classroom together. That way, there's more support and the general ed teacher can continue teaching the general education curriculum. Whereas maybe if the second teacher is a special educator or a multilingual learning specialist, they could be providing support for students with special needs. And it's a win-win for everyone. It's a win-win for the general education students that they can proceed with the general curriculum, but it's also a win-win for our special needs students because they're not taking out of the general ed classroom and they're learning side by side with general education students. So it is definitely a win-win when a district invests the money, the time, the human resources in having co-teachers teaching a class together. In theory, that is. Unfortunately, sometimes that works well. Sometimes it doesn't work as well. Sometimes there might be power struggles, or sometimes there isn't the time in the schedule for co-teachers to sit down and plan together. Those are some of the issues. And then, of course, there's always the issue of one teach, one assist, when we all know that there are multiple ways that we should be doing co-teaching. With that in mind, I'm really excited. We're going to be talking to two specialists about what makes an effective co-teaching team and what we as schools and school districts should be doing to ensure that co-teachers do have the resources that they need to provide the supports and academic services that they need to be providing their students. Tonight, I'm being joined by Belinda Karge. She is a professor at Concordia University in Irvine. I'm also being joined by a repeat guest. Many of my listeners should know and have hopefully listened to Matt Rhoads' previous episodes with us. Matt is an ed tech entrepreneur. He's also a trainer, and then also is an adjunct professor in education leadership programs out in California as well. So both of you, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
And great to have you, Matt. Let's start with Belinda, and then we'll go to Matt. Why co-teaching? Why did you two decide to focus your research, your time on co-teaching?
Absolutely. Co-teaching has been around for a long time. In the 60s, we had some fun with co-teaching in terms of the adults in the classroom really enjoyed working together. But it's only been recently, and I do mean recently, the current data starts at about 2007 forward, showing that there's great student success and student outcomes as a result of co-teaching when it's done effectively. Also, the whole concept of co-teaching, general ed, special ed working together, general ed, bilingual specialists working together, general ed, gifted specialists working together, that whole concept of co-teaching has really evolved. And that's why we created the book Co-Teaching Evolved, and we called it Partnership Strategies for Equitable, Inclusive, and Tech-Powered Classrooms, because we wanted to highlight some of the things that are going on in classrooms currently that are really ultimately supporting students and looking for student success. And our model is focused on 11 co-teaching strategies. We call them strategies because a model is something that's in place in time. A strategy is a plan. It's an instruction piece that you can move and use and equip teachers so that they can be effective when co-teaching.
Belinda, and we're definitely going to talk about a number of those 11 strategies because I think that will be of great interest to the educators listening in on this episode. But before we do that, Matt, why you? Why look at co-teaching?
I was in the trenches doing it for quite some time, and I know what worked and what did not work. And having been in many different co-teaching partnerships and situations and contexts and teaching it a wide range of things from English co-teaching all the way up from 9th to 12th, math, and then social science, all those grade levels, and having multiple partners, really what it was like in the classroom. And then also to presenting and co-teaching and then supporting co-teachers now in my work as an instructional coach and trainer with adult educators. So it's something that I've been doing for quite some time. And I think that with the change in the classroom that's really happened since 2015, and then moving forward with the pandemic, and then here we are now with the advent of generative AI, I think there's a lot that has changed. And I think that we can really throw a little bit of a curveball with the 11 strategies and really further amplify them to support students in an equitable way and move further and forward inclusion when co-teaching is done right.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that, Matt, where you're talking about the benefit being inclusion. And that ties right into what Belinda was just talking about the benefits for special populations of students to be in that co-taught classroom where they're not pulled out. But Belinda, could you talk a little bit more about some of the specific benefits that your research has uncovered about having a co-taught classroom?
Let's talk students first, because we always seem to look at the literature on co-teaching and people go right to the adults and the teachers because we call it co-teaching. But let's talk student benefits, okay? What we know is that when students are in a general ed classroom, learning the content with their peers, receiving content instruction from a teacher who's trained in that level, whether it's general ed or special ed or whoever the teacher is giving instruction, and they're supported with accommodations, adaptations, modifications, supports in that general ed classroom, they're getting the biggest bang for the buck and they're getting the opportunity to elevate their own growth and their own depth of knowledge. And that's a huge benefit for everybody involved. Social skills. It's interesting because the term inclusion actually originated in the 80s, and it was for students with more moderate to severe disabilities. And the idea was just to socialize, just to have them around their peers and have some peer buddies and get to know and be successful in the world. Well, what we've seen in co-taught classrooms is we have students that are invited to birthday parties and get to go on movie dates with friends, and it expands outside of the school community to where they have the opportunity to be an active participant in society. And that's one of the main benefits of what it's all about in terms of working in an inclusive environment. Another benefit for students is having a role model. A student with dyslexia, a student who has neurodiversity problems, a student who has ADHD, having peers that are modeling appropriate behavior, are modeling how to do a problem, are modeling how to problem solve, or modeling even how to read a passage. Those are the kinds of things that they can follow a peer, and they're more likely to pick up on the instruction from a peer than from even the adult in the classroom, even though people don't like me to say that. The reality is the research is very, very strong with that. My fourth point would be student engagement. Just having the opportunity to be a part of a cooperative learning team, to be a part of a Think Right, Pair, Share, to be a part of an opportunity where they can engage again with a peer, learn from a peer, be a part of a peer. That's huge in terms of the benefits. And there's many more, but that's where I would start, is with the student benefits.
And Belinda, what you're pointing out, you were talking about how students could really benefit from having a peer and seeing how things could be done, especially if they're a student in a special population group. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the benefits might be for general education students being in a classroom with special population students.
Well, here's the thing. There's an awesome study done by Don Deschler, who has retired now, but he used to run the research lab at Kansas University, a Research One institution, very well known in the special ed community. And Dr. Deschler's study was published over 1 million times. So when you start thinking about that, that's an impact on the research field. And what he said in one of his studies, we all need differentiation. For example, if I'm a high school teacher, approximately 30% of the students that I am am working with are going to pick up on whatever I'm doing in a classroom. But 70% are going to need something else. And that's for all kids. That's not talking about special needs populations. So now to answer your question, if that 70% of those general ed students, if they are in a co-taught classroom where the teachers are role playing or the teachers are having a conversation with it, they're able to follow and pick up, or the teachers are allowing them a choice opportunity, or the teachers are setting up alternative teaching stations where one group is going to do kind of remedial support, another group is going to move forward, and the students are part of those selections, growth is going to occur. So they're going to have that opportunity to really move forward.
And now, Matt, picking it up from the perspective of teachers, because you had mentioned that you yourself had taught in co-taught classrooms and you are coaching and leading teachers teaching in co-taught classrooms now. What are the benefits for teaching in a co-taught classroom for the educator?
I think that it's a great opportunity to see really good instructional strategies that are modeled. So essentially, if it's a more seasoned teacher and a more novice teacher, you can have that take place. You can also, for example, you can divide up the labor. I think that you can, if you work together and have multiple periods of working together, you can really cut down on how much time that you are taking to plan or assess learning and also do some of the administrative tasks. I think there's also benefits to constantly learning from each other. I mean, each of you have your own strengths and areas of improvement. Maybe one's more geared towards instructional strategies, maybe towards cooperative learning, thinking routines, and maybe one's more has more expertise integrating ed tech tools that has a really good foundation of, hey, I know how to make these different types of universal design for learning playlists that we can integrate into our lessons so that students can have a variety of different ways to demonstrate how they're learning. So I think that there's a lot of really good benefits of learning from each other and navigating co-teaching together, but there needs to be structures in place. And I alluded to one a moment ago, for example, just having multiple periods or you're working together for most of the day, because that allows for you to have that cohesion and that partnership to be more than just 1 hour a day. Another thing is, for example, is planning time. If schools don't allow that planning time, that planning period, or maybe there's a minimum day, a 1 day a week, and they get that additional planning time in the afternoon, I think that those are key structures. Also, I think schools can provide opportunities for when co-taught partnerships are picked, they can have more of like a speed dating type scenario or sort of an opportunity where people get to actually know each other versus just being selected to co-teach. Because generally what we see a lot of times as new teachers being thrown into co-teaching because they have nothing better to really say for themselves, as well as they're the lowest on the totem pole and they're just going to do it because they're just trying to get their feet wet and get closer to years of experience and tenure. I think that it's really important that schools understand structures and systems to make co-teaching work, because co-teaching alone and just having some experience, just understanding the strategies is good, but it's not enough. There's a lot that goes into it that leaders need to understand that before they really put in co-teaching, because we see a lot of times it faltering because a lot of the structures are in place and we have to take that into account.
I'd love to add to that. One of my mentors and one of the prolific authors in the area of co-teaching is Wendy Markowski. She's the CEO of a company called To Teach. And one thing that Wendy talks a lot about is if a leader, a principal, walks into a co-taught classroom, they need to see something going on that they would not see if there was just one teacher alone. And I think that's huge. That's brilliant, because that's what we're going for here. Is we're taking the gifts of both of these educators and asking them to work together in a way that they really wouldn't be doing independently. And that's where the growth factor is happening.
So now, Belinda, you set up my next question wonderfully. What should we be seeing that's different in a co-taught classroom?
For one, we advocate for credentialed teachers or certified teachers. So we're not talking about a paraprofessional working with a teacher. We're talking about two people who've gone to school, learned to be teachers, or hired as teachers at a classroom. So these co-teachers are using their gifts effectively and working together to bring forth the educational knowledge to the students they're with. That's where we get into all those strategies that Matt started to talk about and how we can utilize our gifts. One of the things I've learned a lot about from co-teaching co-teaching with Matt is just basic technology. He'll pop something on the screen and I'll be like, whoa, where did that come from? But that's his gift. He's able to do that he lives and breathes technology every single day. My background is in instruction. And so sometimes somebody will ask a question related to the research and instruction, and I'm typically able to come up with an article or an author for them to go for. That's my gift. And together we make a really good team when we present, because we bring to the table different techniques, different strategies, different gifts that we offer up as a teacher. I think that's what's important.
So now let's get into what some of those 11 strategies are when one is in a co-teaching situation. So Matt, which ones do you want to talk about first?
There's always the one teach, one assist, and that's definitely where we don't want to be at. I want to start off with this notion of team teaching, because I think it's a great way to come together and start a class, because you're sitting in front with the other co-teacher. You may have a slide deck or interactive slide deck. I call it a very dynamic experience, because maybe one person goes over the objective, then someone goes over the agenda, then you go right into that formative assessment to begin the class or that lesson. Maybe one of the co-teachers begins modeling how to complete that math problem before giving another math problem for their students. And then maybe if it's an interactive slideshow with that formative assessment, then that one teacher is now starting to then monitor the student responses as they're working on their digital whiteboard or mini whiteboard as they go through. And then as they start seeing the trend, they may start pulling a few students over to the side and start working with them in a small little station to the far right-hand side. And then as the timer goes, 5-6 minutes left for that opening formative assessment, that one teacher is working with that small group, checking for understanding, maybe showing them one more example or so. And then when they bring them all back, both co-teachers can come back and essentially discuss the problem that they went over. And both of them can add, maybe one goes over an example, then another one does another example. I like to start off with the team teaching piece. And as you noticed, I went over and did a little bit of alternative teaching, where essentially where that small group took place. So you can see that the strategies are very dynamic and they ebb and flow. I always like to start with team teaching, because then that really sets the table for the lesson and can move forward from there. It kind of sets the tone.
It really highlights why it is so important for co-teachers to get a groove going and to work with one another most of the time, so they get into those rhythms where they can co-teach effectively together, and that they have the planning time to do that. Because, and this is unfortunately, I think, one of the reasons we do tend to see one teach, one assist, because it requires no planning time, because one teacher's teaching and the other person's handing out papers, which is a very, very expensive paraprofessional, in my opinion. So I like how you said that, Matt. And I like also how you integrated, in a way, two models: team teaching, as you put it, and alternative teaching. Because to your point, it's not like, okay, I'm going to do team teaching now, but weaving in the different strategies for the needs of the students that you have in that class. I love that. Belinda, are there any strategies you would add to what Matt was saying?
Absolutely. And what I'd love to do is also give a scenario. An amazing middle school team that I worked with, I watched them start their day with parallel teaching. And in parallel teaching, both teachers have the same content, but we divide the class into two. And in the groups, we have mixed students, okay? We're not just doing one group as special ed and one group as general ed. We're mixed groups of students. And they taught parallel teaching as a math class for about 15 minutes. Then they came back together as a class and they did conversation teaching. And it was so much fun to watch. They both took sides of the classroom. They were both holding a whiteboard. And the math teacher was asking the specialist, although the kids don't know that, but I'm just telling you for the scenario, some different things to write on her board. So he would say, can you write the number 1,000,000, for example? And she would write it incorrectly. And then he'd be, well, are you sure? And, and they'd have this conversation back and forth. And then she would start asking him questions. Well, the questions she had come up with while she was just spending 20 minutes with her group, and she saw the challenges some of the students were having. And so she was asking questions that they had asked her, but it was just a fun conversation going on back and forth. And then they did independent work, and both of them monitored the classroom. So it wasn't one teach, one support. It was really both of them working together to monitor and check and just see where students were. So that was just such a cool opportunity. Another strategy that's already been brought up, but I just have to share with this great example, a sixth grade classroom. It was also a math classroom. They give a test every Thursday. And the test only has 3 questions, and it's whatever they're working on. Take 3 questions. If you pass all 3, you go to enrichment group. If you miss one of those 3, you can decide as a student, do I want to go to enrichment, or do I want to back up and really learn the content? But if you miss 2 or 3, you have to back up and go to reteach. And they do this every single Thursday. And they find a mix of kids because math changes all the time. And some of the kids end up in reteach one week, and they end up in enrichment another week, just depending on, what they've picked up and the information. And I just think that's a great way to use alternative teaching. But what that group also does is they run a lot of stations in their classroom. And so they'll set up an independent station where students are working independently. And then maybe one teacher will be doing Pythagorean theorem, let's say, and another teacher is working on, let's say, problem solving, getting ready for state assessment test. And the kids have to spend like 20 minutes at each station during the hour they're with the teacher. I love that model as well.
What I like about that model, when students need the support, they go to support. When they're ready for enrichment, they go for enrichment. And it's not this staid thing where, oh, I'm a good math student or I'm a bad math student, but the needs change every lesson, perhaps even. Students go in and out of support when they need that support, and then they don't get that support when they don't need that support. Having those 2 adults in the classroom allows more of that flexibility to get the support you need, but equally as important, not to get the support and to get the enrichment you need when you are following and understanding the concepts that are being presented. So I'm glad that you mentioned that as well. Now, what would you say, Belinda, and then I'll have a question for Matt. One pushback I always get on parallel teaching is, oh, it's so noisy and confusing when half the class is over here and half the class is over there. And I know what I say to folks, but what do you say to folks when you get pushback on noise level for these kind of things?
Let's take parallel teaching first. With something like parallel teaching, what I say to them is you have to select what type of activity you're doing during parallel. That might be a really good time for explicit instruction, which means that if Matt and I are co-teaching, it's just the 2 of us talking. So the room isn't chaotic. It's not noisy. But let's say if I'm running stations where there's actually, let's say, a science class where there's a lab going on and those kind of things, what I often say to teachers who say that to me is I say, what happens when you normally run a lab? Don't you have students talking? If not, we have a little problem going on here, because we know from the research that students learn by interacting and engaging and talking and sharing and, using their brains, their neurotransmitters. And if you're just having them sit there and listen the whole time, that's not effective. So I push back typically with more of the research, but I also tell them, and I show videos of teachers who've made this work in the confines of what they have. So I've had teachers who will take part of the group out in the hallway, or teachers that'll go to the library, or teachers will go sit out on a beautiful day outside. There's nothing wrong with that, in my opinion. I know some people say, oh, they have to be in the same classroom. I disagree. I think that we are going to ebb and flow and work with this group of students in any way that we can be effective in supporting their needs. And if that means breaking up, using space effectively, let's go for it. Yeah.
Indeed. Now, Matt, moving back to some of the adult issues that we see in co-teaching, the point that you were making about allowing co-teachers to get to know one another is smart, because I have been in many schools where that hasn't been the case, and 2 people have been thrown together, and it's quite apparent that the personalities are not working very well. maybe one teacher is a little bit more dominant. Maybe they think that they are the master teacher and the other one is the assistant. So, in your coaching, Matt, how do you deal with those personality issues, which do sometimes tend to come to the surface?
There's a lot of ways that this can be mitigated. And I think that you can always go back to what I'm going to say is that when you have two people coming together, it's always great to create like a contract, or what we call in our book essential agreements. And you break down essentially not only just the division of labor, but you actually get to talk about what are your philosophies in terms of teaching and learning. And you basically denote that onto the document and essentially create a contract for the co-teaching and how you may interact throughout the entire school year. Spending time and having that structure in place, fill out that essential agreement, that essentially the contract of how you're going to be at least communicating, teaching, dividing up the labor. How can we come together on some shared philosophies such as assessment and grading? I think that definitely can be points of contention at times. So I think really having that in place, and also as a school leader, essentially creating the structures in place so that they can actually have that opportunity when you do have that conflict, when you have something like the essentials agreement, you as an administrator or coach can sit down with both of them and talk about what they've seen in the classroom and then what they've written down for their essential agreements and see, hey, this is not always set in stone, but this is a working document and we can essentially change this as we go forward. That can be a great coaching tool to navigate these difficult partnerships. But the goal really is beforehand, though, is to spend time the preceding school year to match teachers up with people that not only maybe share some of their beliefs, but also you can see that there's a vibe in their personalities, because I think it takes a personality mesh to co-teach well. And I think that can be built over time. But I also think there's different personalities that fit better with co-teaching than others. So that's just some of the ways that I think that you can navigate that.
The area that you just brought up that I'd like us to talk about a little bit, that is sometimes that point of contention, and that is co-assessment. What are some of the ways that you would recommend to teachers teaching in a co-teaching classroom how to assess their students?
This is how I've done it in the past is that we sit, this is also more at the beginning of the year, we sit down and actually create rubrics for a lot of the content that we're going to go over. And we're kind of, then we look at early student work and saying, what does this mean? What does this look like? Especially if it's mathematics and you're problem solving, how many points are you going to allot for not only just the right answer, but maybe the problem solving methodologies for solving linear equations or systems of equations. Essentially, we've had different rubrics throughout different semesters. And I think also too, if you can agree on standards-based grading, I think it's a fantastic way to merge that with co-teaching. I think that is one of the better grading philosophies to move forward with co-teaching versus just a sheer point system that's weighted. So that's kind of where what I've done in the past. I've also done the points in the past as well. And that definitely, we've divided up the labor in terms of assessing essays, for example. We have a rubric and points, and then also checking homework, classwork, etc. We've divided up that, whether it's a couple of weeks or that unit or different student populations. We've done that as well. That also goes with the essential agreements of essentially who's going to be, when and where are you going to be assessing your student work and who's going to do it. And that can be something that's rotating or something that stays in place. I've had it before where the general education teacher focuses on assessing mostly to general education students, which I don't think is generally the best mode of doing this. I think it's best when you split it. There's a wide variety of different ways. And like I said, I think the standards-based approach is the best way to merge with co-teaching. But sometimes you have to figure it out and navigate it with a partnership over the course of maybe a semester, even school year, before you ultimately get to a good place with it.
And those are good suggestions for summative assessment. I am a real fan also of formative assessment. When a lesson is taking place, let's say that we just had an activity where students are interacting, and each of us is kind of walking around, maybe even taking notes with what we're seeing, and then coming back and doing some real-time assessment right then and there and say, hey, Dr. Rhoads, I saw this. And he'd be, hey, Dr. Karge, I saw that. And we can kind of go back and forth and really share. And that way the students know that we're paying attention to what's happening in that classroom. And we're really seeing the growth or non-growth. I mean, if they're not getting it, we can be like, it looks to me like we got to go over this again. What do you guys think? And then we can build it out. I'm also a fan of talking to leadership right up front about getting both teachers on the rosters. There's been so many problems across the United States with these software companies that have developed grading programs where only one teacher is allowed to have access, which is absolutely ridiculous, because then when you have a co-taught classroom, the grade has to be entered by one person. That makes no sense. Or I have to go into Rhoads class to enter. No, we need to talk to these software programs and work it out. And when I get to leadership ahead of time, oftentimes they will talk to the software programs and get it to at least where they would put Rhoads/Karge at the top so that we can get in, because it really sends a message to parents as well. Think of how many school districts now have software programs where at any time I as a parent can go log in and see how my child is doing. Well, if I'm always logging into Rhoads, but yet my student is talking about this Karge person, how does that work? You want your parents to understand co-teaching as well and to know that there are two people giving assessments. I'm also a fan of one teach, one observe. And I'll never forget general ed teacher who said to me one time, you know, Belinda, I've never had a chance to actually watch my classroom. And it was so cool to just sit and observe as my colleague taught the class. And I just wrote down notes of which students were being behavior challenges, who was chatting, who was pulling out a phone underneath their desk, who was elbowing their friend, who was passing a note, all those things you don't see when you're the only person in front of the room. That type of assessment is huge as well, because it builds out all levels, not just academic, but behavior, physical, social, all the whole child aspect of assessment.
And I am as well. And that is not the same thing as one teach, one assist, because one teach, one observe, their role is to observe,
Yes.
not to hand out papers. Really,
Yeah.
the focus is how are we going to increase our impact? And how can I increase my impact as an individual? We've talked about some of the strategies. We've talked about how the strategies interplay with one another. Are there any strategies that we haven't talked about?
If you have mini whiteboards in your class, it's one of the best formative assessment tools that you have, or digital whiteboard tools, like, for example, like Pear Deck, CurryPod, Nearpod, etc. Similar ways of implementing that formative assessment piece. But there's a strategy called graze and tag. So essentially, maybe the problem is presented, and then you have one educator who grazes and strolls through students, viewing whether they're on task and engaged. And then also you have one that's graze and tagging, looking at the dashboard of the digital mini whiteboards. Or if it's a real whiteboard, then you have another educator after one strolls. Maybe that one is going to be working with one student or two students, then another one grazes and tags and seeing if there's someone else that needs help, or they're carrying around their iPad or their computer looking at what students are doing in real time. And then maybe one says, hey, I'm seeing a trend here, so let's just stop the class and then let's go ahead and reteach this. They reteach it together, possibly team teaching, and then they move back to that formative assessment piece. Maybe another problem's given, or they're continuing with that problem and they continue to graze and tag.
And I know the question, you're really talking about the 11 strategies, but I would love to back us up for a minute and just talk about planning, because in order for me to be effective with any of those 11 strategies, I have to have some time with my partner. And as we've already indicated, not every school is going to give people planning time. Yes, that's always what we're advocating for when we talk to leaders. Some have done that. I have many school districts that I consult with that have actually taken the plunge and have done that, but not everybody has. So what are we going to do? And one of the things that I have learned from working with Matt, that I have shared with lots of teachers now, whether we're presenting together or if I present with someone else, is this whole idea of co-planning using technology. It can be as simple as a Google Drive. We have lots of good examples in our book about how to do this effectively in forms that you can utilize. But the simple basics is, I start out and I say, how about if we're working on this language arts lesson where we're going to talk about plot and main idea? I would like to introduce the lesson. So maybe while I'm doing that, you could be doing one teach, one support, and the support would be la la la, and I'm writing it all out. And then Matt could look at that this evening, let's say, or during his prep time, and he could say, oh, that'd be awesome, Belinda. How about if then we pick up and do a graze and tag, and we can do this and this and this. And then I can look later and go, oh my gosh, that would be so much fun if we could role play. Let's do a role play. we're actually doing this. Sometimes we might be on together, but most of the time it's just something that's set up. When Matt and I co-teach, oftentimes one of us will start a slide deck and the other one will go into the slide deck and add their magic, and the next one looks at it. And before you know it, we have a presentation. And yes, it'd be wonderful if we could spend the hour together planning together, but the reality is that's not always going to happen. And so that's one way that if you trust each other and if you're willing to use a technology as your tools, it can be really efficient. The other thing that I always talk to leaders about is it's very cost effective for you to consider hiring a couple of subs a day. Like if your teachers are not able to co-plan together, if they don't have a planning period, it's very cost effective is once a quarter, if you order a couple of subs, and you can even lay it out to where like from 8 to 10, this co-teaching team would meet, and then the two subs would go in this classroom. And then after recess at 10:20, these two teachers meet, and then those same subs would be in different classrooms. And we could get through a set of 6, 8 co-teaching teams with two subs. How cheap is that? And they would actually get a couple hours together to where they could set up some of the initial things that are needed to allow them then to be able to say work with a Google form or set up a sheet or something like that later on.
No, I think that the planning piece is essential, and you can plan now essentially whenever and wherever, which is something that everyone should take advantage of. And I have the ability to use AI co-pilots, as I call them in the book, to help you actually create the content quite quickly. You can use a major frontier large language model like ChatGPT, Claude, Google Gemini, but you can also use tools like Diffit, creates templates with Google Slides or documents, and you can differentiate them of a wide variety of different levels quite quickly in a matter of a few minutes. Or, for example, you can use CurryPod, which turns your presentation into an interactive slideshow with formative assessment questions in a matter of seconds. We have these tools to support us in planning efficiently. And I think also, too, if you are able to leverage them, hopefully more sustainably, so you have more time for yourself and your students.
I don't expect anyone to say any specific names, but are there any particular school districts or schools that you want to shout out for effectively implementing co-teaching models in their school or their district?
I recently spent a couple of days with Santa Monica School District, and they have spent the last 3 years bringing in and supporting their teachers on co-teaching at the secondary level. The teachers are 100% in, and I was really impressed with what's going on. I'm also working with a school district in Southern California, the name of Baldwin Park, and they're the ones who have now allocated planning time. And if for some reason the two teachers don't get the planning time, they've allocated funding for them to actually get paid a couple extra hours to work together after hours to do some planning. And that has really supported and been effective. And of course, not just those two districts, but all the schools that I work with that do have teachers unions, it's important to really think about how we're looking at this from that perspective. And most of them see it as an equality thing. And when districts like Baldwin Park are willing to ante up and pay a little bit extra for planning time, that's equality. And that's something that unions really appreciate. And I realized that both the districts I mentioned were California districts. Last year, I spent a good deal of time on the East Coast, and I learned from the state of Maryland that they actually have an implementation piece for co-teaching in their teacher prep programs. All of their students learn to co-teach in teacher prep. And then the expectation, of course, is that they would continue that in the schools. And I also spent some time in Maine and saw some fabulous co-teaching going on. This is something we're seeing across the United States. Absolutely.
And I'm definitely seeing a lot of co-teaching in my coaching work, not exclusively, but largely in New York City. Matt, anybody you want to shout out doing good work when it comes to co-teaching?
San Marcos Unified in Southern California does a fabulous job. They've been doing it for many years. And within their actually union contract, they have that additional planning period time as part of that contract. I wanted to mention that US Prep, which is an association that supports credentialing programs across the country, including the university that I'm associated with San Diego State. We're really focused on implementing co-teaching as part of the teacher preparation process, moving towards the beginning of their teaching process, learning how to teach along with their guide teacher in a co-taught scenario, focusing on some of the basic strategies at first, but then moving up toward team teaching, alternative teaching, station teaching, etc. I see a big movement across the United States and some larger universities. The appetite is there for building the capacity of teachers across the country in co-teaching.
In fact, my university, where I'm an adjunct, Brooklyn College, we as well have worked with US Prep. US Prep worked with us to develop our student achievement chart, which our student teachers use to plan their pre-assessment and then do their post-assessment. So we could actually measure growth in what they're doing with students. Student teachers can actually show impact when they go and they apply for a full-time job. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want listeners to know?
The main thing is don't be afraid to try. Sometimes people were trained to be in this individual classroom as an educator, and it's kind of your world. And it's a little bit of fear having a colleague watch you all day long, And so I think people are afraid of that sometimes and don't realize how much you can learn from each other. And that once you take off the mask of being fearful and just lay it on the table and be like, hey, I don't know how to do this. Will you help me? Or this is a strength I have. Can I throw that in? That's where teams really move forward and can be very successful.
I think it's just versatile. I mean, I think it, like we just mentioned, it's one of the best forms of professional learning I think that you can have in your career. But I also think that having a good instructional coach is great for newer teacher partnerships so that you can have a third set of eyes or objective eyes towards that situation and having that coach provide feedback. And also, I think it's important for co-teachers to go watch other co-teachers teach through video, or whether that is getting an opportunity to go observe another co-teaching class, what you can see across different content areas and grade levels. It's not this narrow niche. It's actually quite broad.
In the book, we have QR codes that lead you to examples, various video examples of all 11 co-teaching strategies. And that's kind of fun for people to be able to just go see it.
I love it. Dr. Rhoads, Dr. Karge, thank you so much for your time today. This has been great.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for having us, John.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.